Okay, hello again. This is Dr. Jenkins, and this time we are talking about water and fluid balance and thermoregulation. Quite a bit on our plate. We'll definitely break it up into multiple videos, but a really important topics. So we're going to first talk about water, its functions, some characteristics of it. Electrolytes go along with that. Then we're going to talk about fluid balance, how to balance the water and the electrolytes. And then at the end, we'll talk about thermoregulation, our body's response and the ability to acclimate to different temperatures. And also we'll touch upon the ability to acclimate to altitude. Okay, here we go with water. All right. We may remember, folks, this is a macronutrient. It sure is. Remember the macronutrients? By now, you should know it like the back of your hand. I suppose an updated version of that is, you should know it like your favorite song. What are the four macronutrients? Carbohydrates, fats, protein, and water. What are the micronutrients? Vitamins and minerals. So here is our last macronutrient. Our bodies are made up of quite a lot of water. It's usually somewhere around 60%. Okay, so I have an idea about that number. Our body is largely water, and that's how it's supposed to be. Make sure you review the important functions of water. I have put in red the information that you need to know for our quizzes and exams. Obviously, water helps to transport nutrients. That one's not starred or not in red, but it's there. So water is the primary component of our blood. And our bloodstream, that's how we transport things everywhere. Water helps us to protect. You may not think about that, but I think once we talk about it, it makes total sense. We have a thin layer of water around our brain. We have a thin layer of water around our spinal cord, around our heart, and they protect. It kind of gives buoyancy and it protects these very important organs. Water also helps with body temperature regulation. Everyone here knows about sweating. We know that sweating is a way to release heat and therefore cool our core temperature. We do that by sending water to the surface of the skin. And that water on the surface of the skin is sweat that is evaporated off the surface of the skin into a water vapor into the air. And that process has a cooling effect. But we need water in order to be able to sweat. Water functions in lubrication. Particularly for athletes, we got to think about the synovial fluid in our joints. All of your synovial joints, knee, ankle, hip, shoulder, elbow, wrist, you name it. There's got to be fluid in there to lubricate, prevent friction. And I know this one may not be as cool because it's more chemistry related, but it's still really important. Water is a reactant in pretty much every chemical reaction, especially those that are related to sports. When our muscles metabolize nutrients for energy, we need water. When we digest food to absorb it, we need water. So water participates in a lot of chemical reactions. So water is really important. Okay, so we're going to look at where. Where in the body do we have water? And we tend to compartmentalize. So we have fluid, and we're going to use the word fluid. This fluid is mostly water, so it's almost like saying the same thing. Most of our fluid or water is stored inside of the cells. Intracellular, within. So about 2/3 of all of our water is actually held inside the cells. Our cells are just puffed full of water. Just ignore that little error message there, I'm sorry. So about 2/3 of our water is stored inside of the cells, which means that The remaining third or so is stored outside in the extracellular fluid. You need to know these two compartments and the percentage of water housed in each. Now, along with the water, we can't just talk about water because in almost every instance, these electrolytes are just as important. You know, when I bring up the word electrolytes, a lot of people, yeah, I know what those are. They're in Gatorade, you gotta replenish them. But do you really know what they are and what their functions are? Well, good thing you're here with me because we're gonna talk about it. Let's talk about it. An electrolyte is a charged particle that carries a current. Now, the two that we're going to talk mostly about would be sodium. The symbol for sodium is Na, and it's a positively charged ion. And we're going to talk a lot about potassium. The symbol for potassium is K, and that's also positively charged. There are other ones. Chlorine, which can form chloride, that's negatively charged. Magnesium is positively charged. So when you see that plus or minus, that tells us it's a charged particle. And in the body, an electrolyte is a charged particle that has the ability to carry a current. That's the simplest way I can think to explain this. Now, there are other charged particles. Iron is a charged particle. But iron, even though it's a charged particle, it doesn't carry a current, so it's not an electrolyte. So I don't want you to think, just because you see a negative or a positive, that doesn't mean that it's an electrolyte. It could be a charged particle or an ion, but not all ions are electrolytes. But many of them are, and we're going to focus on potassium and sodium. I'm going to go back a slide. The importance of these electrolytes, they play a role in fluid balance. Our ability to have the right amount of fluid in the right part of the body at the right time, we rely on these electrolytes. Check for that one. Our ability to contract muscles, or our ability to generate nerve impulses. You know what? We need electrolytes for that. We need electrolytes for that. So these charged particles that have this capability to carry a current, they're so important. They have all these functions. And here they are again. Fluid balance, fluid movement, they help muscles contract. They're needed to generate nerve impulses. So these are all important to athletes. So electrolytes, they're not important just for athletes. Yeah, athletes have to worry about this more because they're contracting their muscles more. They've got to regulate fluid balance more. They do have to send more nerve impulses. All these things are required for athletes to function. But an everyday person, they need some electrolytes too, not as many. Okay, we're going to focus on two, and I've already introduced them, sodium and potassium. They are both positively charged, but I want you to know where they are. Sodium is found in much higher amounts outside of the cell. And remember before, we called that the extracellular fluid. Whereas potassium is found in higher amounts inside of the cell, or that is intracellular fluid. Cool. You don't need to know these concentrations, 150 millimoles per liter or 4 to 5 milliequivalents per liter. You don't need to know those. So here we go. Now we can complete the whole picture. And again, I'm sorry about that message. We have let me go back. Let's do red over here. Can't decide what color I want. We have the intracellular intracellular fluid, intracellular fluid, and this is where we find more potassium, right? So our intracellular fluid compartment, this is where we hold about 2/3 of all of our fluid. It is inside the cells, and this is where we have a lot more potassium ions or electrolytes, versus the extracellular fluid. This is where we have the remaining 1/3 or so of fluid. I know those two together don't add up to 100. I'm just guesstimating here. Let's use green. And this is our extracellular fluid. Extracellular fluid, between the cells, extracellular fluid. And this is where we find more sodium. All right. Excellent. Okay, we're going to skip that. Now, water and electrolytes, they're constantly moving. And I think you probably had an idea of that anyway. But these are always moving. So even though we have 66% of fluid in the intracellular fluid at a given time, there's always going to be some movement. Maybe some water leaves the cell. And then a little bit later, some water comes back in. Maybe some sodium goes into the cell. Oh, great. Maybe some potassium leaves the cell. Okay. So there is constant movement. Maybe it's because of things that we bring in, things that we drink. Maybe it's because of a need to sweat, so we have to shift some fluid around. There's all sorts of reasons. It's not just if you're drinking. It's not just if you're exercising. Water and electrolytes, there's always some movement between the intra and extracellular fluid compartments. All right, so we've established the basics. We talked about the basic functions of water. We introduced the functions of electrolytes. Now let's begin to talk about fluid balance, water balance or fluid balance. I like this little picture. It comes from I don't think it comes from your textbook. I think it's a different textbook I borrowed it from. But I like it because it's simple. The idea here, folks, it's pretty simple if we really break it down. We need to bring in however much water we lost. If we lost 2 liters of fluid in a day, how much water should we be bringing in that day? 2 liters. If we have lost 3 liters in a day, how much should we be bringing in to replace it? 3. So really, it should be equal. It isn't always the case. There's always going to be periods where we are a little bit low or a little bit high. But overall, the goal should be to match. All right, let's break down that picture, right? So here we're going to look only, right now, let's get that red back on. Here we're going to look only at fluid intake, water intake. So if you look at this water bottle, you can see what is the primary way that we bring in water? Drinks. You don't have to know the 7 cups, but just know that we bring in most of our water through drinks. And there's also some water in food. Of course. I mean, obviously things like soup, tomato sauce, pasta sauce, but even think about certain vegetables. Certain vegetables have a very high water content, like eggplant. So there is water in food, even if you don't really think about it. So we bring in most of our fluid through drink and through food. You can see there a small amount of water is produced through metabolism. It's not in red, so you don't have to know it, but I'm just reminding you or just pointing out all those chemical reactions that we talked about, chemical reactions happening all the time. These chemical reactions often have water as a byproduct. Not only is water needed for some of them, for many of them, water is also produced as a byproduct for many of them. So therefore, we do produce some metabolic water. But that's very small compared to what we bring in through drinks and food. You can see an average person per day brings in about 2.2 liters of fluid. I'm not going to ask you that number, but that would be an average male. All right, now we're on the other end of things. What are ways in which we lose water? We lose a lot of water through the kidneys as urine. We lose water through sweat, but of course this is variable. Depends on the temperature, depends on what you're doing. We also lose some water in the breath that we exhale, and there's also some water in our poop. But the two primary would be urine and sweat. Sweat is of course very sedentary, sweat is of course very variable depending on what you're doing. And actually our urine output is also variable depending on our fluid intake and other factors. But you just have to know what's in red. All right, now the body has to have a way to regulate this. How does the body know when to shift water from here to here? How does the body know when to retain more water if it's dehydrated and it can't afford to release water through urine? Well, let's start with the brain. The part of the brain that is going to be overseeing our fluid balance is the hypothalamus. This is our brain's quote-unquote thirst center. This is a part of the kind of the middle deep part of the brain called the diencephalon, and there's a region called the hypothalamus, which actually has many functions. Hypothalamus plays a role as a gland, and it can produce two hormones on its own, ADH and oxytocin. The hypothalamus plays a role in thermoregulation. Hypothalamus plays a role in our hunger, our satiety, our feeling of satiety, and our hypothalamus also plays a role with how thirsty we are. And then we rely on a bunch of hormones. There's some hormones that tell our body to retain water and not pee it out. So if you haven't been drinking enough, your hypothalamus will get wind of that. There are receptors in your body that will tell your hypothalamus, hey, we don't have enough water. Your hypothalamus will process that. And as a result, hypothalamus will send out hormones that tell the kidneys to retain water. Don't pee it out, retain it because we need it. Or the other can be true. If you've been drinking a lot, then hormones will go to the kidney to tell it to excrete more fluid in the urine. Or we can utilize hormones as well as nerve impulses to send water to the surface of the skin for sweating. And then if you lose more sweat like that, hypothalamus is going to send messages to you to tell you you're thirsty, so you'll drink to replenish it. All right. You need to know what's in red. I've given you some examples. You don't need to know the specific hormones, just the basic idea. Okay. All right. I skipped that because you don't need to know the specifics. It's there if you want. Now, of course, our body's ability to regulate fluid balance is susceptible to so many factors. And these are just some of them. Okay, so you have to know what's in red. During exercise, we obviously lose more water through sweat. And that sweat is likely also going to contain some sodium. And people tend to be, this is very individualized. Some people tend to be salty sweaters more so than others. Some people's sweat have a higher sweat rate than others. So it differs between people. But that's something to think about. When we're exercising, we're going to lose more fluid, and we will likely lose more sodium along with it. Environment, obviously, don't overthink this. When we're in a hot and or humid environment, we lose more fluid. We need to sweat more to keep our body cool. When we are in a cooler or less humid environment, we don't sweat as much, so we don't need to replenish as much. Something that is not in red, but is something that you might be interested in, won't be on a test, but altitude. Probably the number one piece of advice to people going to altitude, no matter if you're an athlete or not, is to hydrate. Hydrate. So when we go to altitude and the atmospheric pressure changes, it has many different effects on the body. And one of them is a dehydration effect. So one of the best things you can do if you're traveling to a place of higher altitude, whether you're going to exercise or not, is to hydrate. But that's not on the test. All right, we will be talking more about thermoregulation and hot environments versus cold environments at the end of this module. Other things. So we talked about temperature that can affect fluid balance. Let's talk about gender. Males tend to have a greater surface area, which means that they have the ability to release more sweat. So on average, typically men will sweat at a higher rate than women. They'll sweat with more volume. What's interesting, though, and this part won't be on the test, but what's interesting is men, even though they tend to sweat more in volume and at a faster rate, women seem to be able to keep up with thermoregulating, even though they don't sweat as much. Women just rely a little bit more on some of the other methods we have for thermoregulation, and women tend to be a little bit more efficient in their ability to evaporate and sweat. Men tend to be a little bit more of wasteful sweaters, where not all of the sweat is actually evaporated. Children tend to have a higher core temperature. And that means that, and also they have less surface area, they can't sweat as well. They don't have as much surface area, and their core temperature is already a little bit higher. So, the example that I always think about would be the coach of the Pop Warner football team who wants his little guys to be really tough. Oh, it's hot out, you're in pads, no water break, we got to make it tough. Well, you have to understand the physiology. Younger individuals, 10, 12, 14, 16, they have a higher, especially the younger ones, they have a slightly higher core temperature, and they have less surface area with which to sweat from. On the other end of things, older adults tend to have a reduced ability to thermoregulate with age. Body composition. If you have a higher fat mass, think about an offensive lineman in football. They tend to have a higher fat mass. Well, they're going to produce more heat because it's like they're wearing an insulation jacket just in the layer of fat they have around their body. And so that makes them hotter, which means they have to get rid of more heat. But also think about in a person with greater fat mass, in order to sweat, we've got to send that fluid to the surface of the skin. Well, if that fluid has to travel through a bunch of fat tissue before it gets to the surface of the skin, that's going to slow down the process. So it is more difficult. It just takes longer to get that fluid to the surface of the skin to be able to evaporate it. And then fitness level. As we improve our fitness, we get better at thermoregulating. We have a quicker sweat rate. We tend to be more efficient sweaters. We sweat earlier onset of sweating, all these things. Okay, well, because we talked about how things should be, we have to talk about how things can be abnormal. What happens when there's an imbalance? Well, if you bring in, oh, I got the wrong way here, where my head is. If you lose more water If you lose more than you bring in, you're going to be in a period of dehydration. Or if I lose less water than I bring in other words, if I bring in more water than I lose, I could be overhydrated. Dehydration, when you lose more than you bring in. You can read through some of the symptoms. I venture to guess that a lot of people out there have experienced being dehydrated a little bit. And, we're not perfect, so we can expect, especially with the changing seasons, think about when it first gets hot out, you're not used to the heat, you're not acclimated. It is easier to get dehydrated. Or maybe you just have a really busy day at work or school and it's hard to get enough water in. So, on one hand, we have to be nice to ourselves and acknowledge we're not perfect. But we don't want to be in a period of dehydration for too long. And we don't want to be in a period of dehydration that is severe. We expect to have minor undulations where for a little period we're more hydrated, the next period we're less hydrated. And you can read some of the effects. This can lead to heat illness, which could be deadly. You can read through the treatment and the prevention. Up there on the right-hand corner is Corey Stringer, 2001, preseason for the Minnesota Vikings. Lineman, right? Exercising in the heat, more difficult for him to thermoregulate, kept pushing, got heat stroke and passed away. As a matter of fact, at UConn, there's a big research center called the Corey Stringer Institute, KSI. And their focus is all about thermoregulation research, so we can learn more about it and hopefully prevent what happened to him. In addition to having an imbalance of just straight old-fashioned water, well, we're going to have an imbalance of electrolytes possibly too. Because just as water moves into and out of the cells, just as we lose water when we sweat, electrolytes move into and out of cells. Electrolytes can be lost through sweat. The more common one is hyponatremia, a condition of low blood sodium. If you break the word down, hypo means less, so we have low sodium. The symbol for sodium is Na, and it's in the word. Hyponatremia, a condition of low blood sodium. Sometimes you'll also see hyperkalemia go along with that, where you have low sodium in the extracellular fluid. We might have high potassium in the extracellular fluid. These first two would be the most common electrolyte imbalances. The first one, though, is more common, hyponatremia. When it comes to salty sweaters, some people are more salty than others. So a part of it is just knowing yourself. I'm not embarrassed to say I tend to be a bit of a salty sweater, but not as much as some of my friends. So some of my Ironman friends sweat even more than I do, and they have even saltier sweat. So they need to consider more salt replenishment, like a salt tablet, while they're doing long exercise sessions. Maybe you've seen salt on the surface of your skin after exercise. Maybe you have a dog and after a run or after practice comes over and licks your legs because they're so salty and delicious. Or you might see a white residue around a headband or a hat. I mentioned hyponatremia. This is the most common of the electrolyte imbalances. Typically, this could come from one of two routes. If you sweat a lot, so you lose a lot of sodium and water, and you don't replenish it, well, you could have low blood sodium, right? So through excessive sweating, I'm sweating so much, I'm losing water, and I'm losing sodium. So what's left in my body are low sodium levels. But another and probably more common way that someone gets hyponatremia is through overhydration. We think about our marathon runners, our Ironman athletes. They're so focused on hydration that they may even take too much. And if you bring in too much water, you're diluting the sodium. So the relative sodium concentration goes down. There was a case up at Plattsburgh, probably 20 years ago by now, maybe 15, I don't remember. Up at Plattsburgh, there was a men's lacrosse, I think it was lacrosse, a men's athlete. And they had the, freshman initiation where they made all the young guys on the team drink alcohol. But this one particular athlete didn't drink alcohol. So they said, okay, you're just going to drink water. But I want you to funnel water. Just when we're funneling beer, you funnel water. Well, to be fair, the people drinking beer were better off because he drank so much water that it just diluted the sodium in his bloodstream. He became extremely hyponatremic, among other things, and he died from overhydration. The cells filled with fluid and they burst. Not so good. You can read about some of the predisposing risk factors. I'm not going to ask you about those, but there they are. You can read about some of the signs and symptoms. Some people choose to take like a salt pill. This would only be for our endurance athletes. I was able to get enough salt replenishment through drinks like Gatorade or Accelerate or Endurox. But some people who are excessive sweaters in endurance situations may benefit from a salt tablet. You can read about the treatment. Okay. Here's who I was talking about, Corey Stringer. Really a sad situation. If you want to see the real effects of extreme dehydration and hyponatremia, there's kind of a famous video of Julie Moss, 1982, Ironman, old school. This link may not be active anymore. If it isn't, I apologize. But you can just type into YouTube, Julie Moss Ironman, and you'll see her literally crawl across the finish line. Her body was completely shutting down. So remember, if we don't have the proper electrolyte balance, what is it going to affect? Our ability to send nerve impulses? She was confused, disoriented. Not having the correct electrolyte balance will impact our ability to contract muscles and, of course, maintain fluid balance. All right. So I wanted to give an example from my own experience, and not because I want to talk about myself too much, but I actually have the medical record form from when I myself became dehydrated, hyperthermic. So here I am, a long time ago now, 2008, Burlington, Vermont Marathon. Oh, mile 8, I was feeling great. Yeah. But this was held in May, and it was 85 degrees, so I was not acclimated or accustomed to the heat. Think about a May marathon. When are you doing most of your training? In the winter and early spring. So I had been training in cold weather. So no matter how much I hydrated this day, it was going to be a challenging day because you're just not used to it. Well, around mile 24, 25, I became disoriented. I was kind of running to the side, almost hit the guardrail. I don't remember crossing the finish line. I did. They took me to the medical tent. Let's point out some things. So I was dehydrated, right? So look at some of the symptoms that were circled. Lightheaded. Why would I be lightheaded? Why would I have an altered mental status? I'm not making this up, folks. Because I had an electrolyte imbalance. And that means that it was more difficult for my body to make a nerve impulse. So I wasn't able to do all those normal things I would be able to do if my nerve impulses were working properly. Let's look at some of my data. Look at my blood pressure. 100 over 60. This is right after running a marathon, folks. Right after running a marathon. What should blood pressure be at rest? 120 over 80? Mine was 100. It was low. Why was my blood pressure so low? Because I had a low fluid volume. I had not been able to keep up with hydrating for how much I was sweating, so I didn't have a very high blood volume. Therefore, my blood pressure was low. There just wasn't enough blood. Meanwhile, and this is a normal circumstance, your blood pressure will be low if you're dehydrated, but your pulse will be through the roof. That is crazy, right? So if my heart can't, if my heart can't pump out enough blood, it'll just try and pump out faster to try and meet the needs of the body. Look at my temperature, 101.69. Let's just say it's 101.7. That's higher than it should be. I was hyperthermic, and my oxygen saturation was 93. That is not good. It should be 97 to 100. I'm not going to ask you the specifics on a quiz or an exam. I just think it's interesting. Look at the labs, 138. So what they did is they took my blood right there, gave me an IV, took me some blood, took blood, did the blood sodium and blood potassium. So let's go back, 7.8 for potassium, 130 for sodium. Let's go back to these electrolytes. 138.7. So I was at 138 for sodium. So hyponatremia is typically diagnosed when you're below 135. So I was towards the lower end, but by the definition of the book, I wasn't yet hyponatremic. But what about that potassium? I know we got to go way back. This learning thing takes hard, huh? Nah, it's cool. There we go. So it was 138, right? So it was 138 sodium, and I was 7.8. So I was definitely hyperkalemic. So even though I was on the border for hyponatremia, I'm going to go again here. If you want to look away so you don't get motion sickness. There's no other way for me to go from screen to screen. So, people don't think it can happen to them, but it absolutely can. And I tell you, once you've really been dehydrated, this is the worst I've ever felt in my entire life. It was not good. Okay. Oh, yeah. So I was under on the sodium, high on the potassium. Not good. Lightheaded, weakness, altered mental status. Yes. Okay, we're going to finish up our discussion on dehydration, talk about overhydration, then we'll end this video. Dehydration can, of course, impact performance. Okay, on average, athletes' core temperature goes up 0.2 degrees Celsius for every 1% of body weight loss. That's fine. You have to know what's in red. You can begin to have impairment, meaning it can negatively affect your performance when you have as little as 2% loss of body weight. And that really isn't that hard to do if you're sweating a lot. So this is where we start to see the dysfunction begin, when you lose 2% or more of your body weight. There's some other information here. You don't need to know it specifically, but there's some other information. Yeah. Why? Well, we become dehydrated, and it has a negative effect on performance because our blood volume goes down. We're not able to send as much blood to the skin, which means we can't sweat as much. If I can't sweat as much, I can't get rid of as much heat. I typically have a higher core temperature to start with and a lower ability to use muscle glycogen. But you need to know what's in red. As I already mentioned, ingesting too much fluid can also be bad. This is something that does happen in endurance athletes. If you're doing a marathon or an Ironman, you have to be focused on hydration. And sometimes if you drink too much or drink too much of the wrong thing, drink too much water only, you could become overhydrated. The real problem, the real potential for danger here is that you have so much fluid, your cells take on water and they burst. This is what happened in that Plattsburgh lacrosse player. Okay, you can read about that. Here's an old link, but it was SUNY Plattsburgh. Alrighty. I'm going to end there. When we come back, we'll pick it up and we'll talk about, what are some requirements? What are some recommendations for fluid intake?